as you might be aware, there was a little election a couple days ago. It had a few surprises, I think, for a lot of people. Shortly before the election, there was some talk that what was the state going to do when Prop 30 failed. There was a thought that maybe the Democrats could get a majority in the Senate, but certainly not in the Assembly. Heck, there was even a Gallup poll that I think showed that Romney was leading nationwide. Needless to say, the election had some interesting results for a lot of different people, and we're very fortunate today to have two experts in California's views of the public, shall we say, here to tell us what happened and why. We have with us today Mark Baldassare, the president and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California, and we have Mark DiCamillo, the director of the Field Poll. We did a coin flip at the beginning, and Mark DiCamillo will be speaking first. If you'll help me with offering a warm Sacramento Press Club welcome.
Well, this is always a pleasure for me. I'm sure it is for Mark. It's like the Marx Brothers. I wish it were a comedy routine, but it's really more serious. But it's really an enjoyable event for me, and I look forward to it, and it actually focuses a lot of my attention to what just happened in ways that probably I would never do, at least in this concentrated a fashion, if this event weren't here. So I really thank the Press Club for inviting me again. I think it's an important event. I have some prepared remarks, and certainly at the end, after Mark speaks, I will be much more wide-ranging in my commentary. But I do have some thoughts about this election that I would like to share, because I think the 2012 elections here in California may prove to be a turning point in California politics, and one that has been many, many years in the making, as the political might of the expanding ethnic voting population really exerted its full force. According to the exit polls, and I have been in the papers here and there talking about the accuracy of the exit polls, but I honestly want to say that the exit polls, generally speaking, are fairly reliable, and they usually get it right, and I can quibble with certain percentages here and there, but literally what comes out of the exit polls is so valuable to all of us following the elections, and they're doing such a huge effort on one day, 35 polls, I believe, in 35 states, and the people doing them are so good at it. I want to discount the quibbling, but I do want to take, and I will address it if you'd like in my question and answer, but the main thrust of the exit polls, I think, are accurate. And if you look at the exit polls here in California, 40% of the turnout was composed of Latinos, African Americans, and Asian Americans. So give or take a percentage point or two, let's go with that number. And that is why that's one of the reasons why I think this election was so significant, because we've never had a turnout of ethnic voters of that size before. And what it means is that the turnout of ethnic voters was probably equal to, because 40% is about the population share of ethnic voters in the overall registered voter population in California. So what that means is collectively ethnic voters turned out in roughly the same proportion as white non-Hispanic voters. We've never seen that before. And the preliminary vote counts, they're still counting votes, as you know, has Obama carrying California by 21 points. This despite the fact that the exit poll was showing that white non-Hispanic voters in California were voting for Mitt Romney by 8 points. And that's a reversal from 2008, when California white non-Hispanics voted for John McCain by 6 points. This means that Obama owes his entire, not insignificant, huge victory in California to the turnout and the voting preferences of the state's ethnic voters. The exit poll is showing Latinos for Obama by 45 points, Asian Americans by 58 points, African Americans by 93 points. While not as extreme you can find the same voting pattern in the exit poll in the vote on Proposition 30, which was the only proposition, unfortunately, that they covered. I'd wish that they had covered more. But in that one, it's leading by 8 or 9 points in the current vote counting. And if you look at the votes of white non-Hispanics, in the exit poll, they were evenly divided. So the reason of its passing, again, is the collective will of the ethnic population, which voted for Prop 30 by about 20 points collectively. When I first began polling in California at Field, this was in the late 1970s, the influence of ethnic voters on election outcomes was much less. And the top of the ticket candidate races were typically much more competitive affairs, with each party winning, their fair share of the elections. For example, in the 16 top of the ticket election races between 1978, when I first started, and 1994, the GOP candidate won the top of the ticket race 9 times, while the Democratic candidate won it 7 times. But 1994 appeared to be a turning point as ethnic voter participation began its ascent. And what appeared to stimulate that surge was the passage of the highly divisive illegal immigration initiative, Proposition 187, which, as we all know, had the full support of the California GOP and Governor Wilson, who was running for re-election that year. If you compare the demographic characteristics, the ethnic breakdown, of the registered voter population in 1994 with what it is today, what you'll find is that California the registered voter population has increased by 3.5 million voters. And if you look at that increase, 3 million of the 3.5 is coming from the increase in voting share of the Latinos and Asian American voters. As this demographic transformation has been taking place in the state's electorate, California's Latino and Asian American voters have been becoming increasingly supportive of Democratic candidates. In the 1980s and early 1990s, it was not unusual for a Republican candidate running statewide to get in the mid-40% range in the support levels of Latino voters and Asian American voters. Ronald Reagan did that in his runs for president, George Deukmejian in his re-election run in 1986, Pete Wilson even in his first term run for governor in 1990. Compare that to this year's election outcome, in which Romney was only able to get 27% of the Latino vote and 21% of the Asian American vote. It's no coincidence that over this period, California changed from what I would consider to be called a competitive purple state in presidential politics to now one of the nation's bluest of blue states, with Democrats winning each of the last 4 presidential elections here by double-digit margins, and the last 2, apparently, by 20 or more points. As the state's ethnic voters have taken on greater prominence, the field poll itself has been devoting more of our resources to trying to understand the opinions of ethnic voters and the reasons behind their voting preferences. In the 2010 and 2012 election cycles, 7 of the 13 statewide field polls that we conducted were conducted in 6 and sometimes 7 languages to try to broaden the coverage of non-English speaking voters. And these polls also attempted to include additional samples of ethnic voters, primarily Asian American voters, so that we could actually double-click on this polyglot of voters that we call Asian Americans. It's really many different subsets of different types of Asian American voters. And then when combined with our normal Latino and African American samples, we hope these multi-ethnic polls were able to illuminate for us a little more clearly the policy positions and the preferences of ethnic voters, and I'd like to just share some of the results with you, because I think this is really what was driving the election. The first and most obvious policy issue that's of import, much higher salience to ethnic voters, is clearly illegal immigration and what to do with the illegal immigrants who are here in this country right now. Should they have a path to citizenship or not? This is something that is overwhelmingly supported by ethnic voters and even among a majority of California's general public, and it's certainly the first issue that most people talk about when you're saying, okay, we're going to start appealing, or try to appeal to the ethnic voters. You start talking about illegal immigration. I'm hearing that on the network airwaves right now. But while illegal immigration is that first top of mind kind of thought or mention or policy issue, it's really not the one that I would point to as having the broadest influence on their voting preferences for Democrats. I think it has more to do with the way ethnic voters view the role of government. The network exit poll actually documented this when it asked California voters whether the government should do more to help solve the nation's problems or whether it was doing too many things that were better left to businesses and individuals. On that issue, California white non-Hispanics are evenly divided. On that issue, ethnic voters in California are almost 2-to-1 of the view that government should be doing more. And a concrete example of this is how ethnic voters in our polls have responded to 3 waves of surveys now that we've done annually on the California Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare. We've conducted these multi-ethnic surveys in each of the last 3 years since the passage of Obamacare, and what we're finding is that, California, as a state, the entire population of voters anyways, is supportive of Obamacare by about 13, 14 points, and that's held pretty consistently. But again, it's the same demographic. The white non-Hispanics are evenly divided. The ethnic voters of all stripes are supportive of Obamacare 2-to-1, and by some groups even more than that. So a main reason behind that desire and support for the health reform law is revealed in other questions in the survey, and it mainly has to do with self-interest, as you might expect. Most ethnic voters believe that Obamacare will benefit them and their families, whereas most white non-Hispanics are very skeptical on that front. In fact, many white non-Hispanics think it will actually serve as a negative for their family. Other findings from our multi-ethnic surveys that provide additional clues as to why ethnic voters are now so one-sided in their support of Democrats has to do with a number of social issues that we include from time to time on our field poll surveys. And this was actually something that I really wasn't expecting to find. You just had to look for it. What we found is that on some social issues, such as same-sex marriage, marijuana legalization, if you look at the ethnic voting population, there are huge generational differences in attitudes on these social issues. Republicans have long held that one of the routes to winning the hearts of ethnic voters is just to appeal to their traditional values and to make that a theme in their outreach. What these polls are showing is that that may work for the older population of ethnic voters in this state. Clearly, they are more conservative and are in line with pretty much the GOP opposition to same-sex marriage or marijuana legalization. But the under 35 ethnic voter is very much like the under 35 white voter in California. This is interesting to me. I mean, it kind of speaks to the melting pot that is California. That once immigrants settle here, it's the sons and daughters who get raised here who then start taking on the same attitudes and opinions and cultural norms of their generational cohorts. And we're clearly seeing that on some of these issues. So this all, in my opinion, just to sum it up, bodes very poorly, as you can imagine, for the long-term prospects of the California Republican Party. Because the demographic changes that we're seeing in play over the last 18 years will continue into the foreseeable future. Demography marches on. So as the GOP voter registration rolls now dip below 30%, and as we witness an election in which the GOP candidate for president carried white non-Hispanic voters by 8 points but lost the general election by 20 or 21 points, it's probably time to begin listening more attentively to the voices of the state's large and growing ethnic voter population. Thank you very much.
Very good comments, Mark. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I enjoyed talking to many of you during the course of the election year, and even more so now having a chance after the election to share some observations and to hear some questions from you. I thought that what I would like to do, and I'm going to try to do it in just a few moments because I know that all of you have come here with many questions you'd like to ask us, is to give you some of my thoughts about this current election year and what we saw in our polling, and talk a little bit about what's next in 2013 and look ahead a little bit to the 2014 election. So I want to spend some time on each of those issues. Although it's tempting to really take all the time to look at this fascinating and I think historic election which we just faced. But first of all, I wanted to call attention to a piece that I published right before the election. It was a PPIC report called Improving California's Democracy. And in that piece, we took a look at our 2012 surveys, the 5 that were conducted before the piece came out, about 10,000 adults. And while I agree with Mark, the change over time in the California electorate, very important to take note of. I think also important to take note of the fact that as we continue to look at the fact that demographics is changing in the state and our electorate is changing, our general population continues to change, and we still see some major demographic differences between those who vote and those who don't vote in California in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of income. And while there was a lot said towards the end of the election about the all the success of the online voter registration, we have so much more work to do in California in terms of engaging the emerging majority population in this state. At the end of registration, there were still 5.5 million adults who were eligible to vote, who weren't registered to vote in California. And what we know from our polling, because we poll all adults and then look at registered voters and likely voters, is that that population is significantly different than the population that was voting even in this election. So I wanted to put that out there, first of all, the importance of building on the success we had in this election and hopefully engaging more adults who were eligible to vote in the state's elections, recognizing that also if there is to be immigration reform in the next couple of years, which a lot of people are saying is likely, the numbers who are eligible to vote will increase that much more. And we have 28 million adults roughly in California altogether. And if large numbers of going beyond that 5.5 million. So that to me was a big takeaway from our polling earlier in the year. There are a number of key groups that we look at in an election year, which I'm sure a lot of you are also focused on. Mark talked about Latinos, very important, influential group. Independent voters or no party preference. The youth vote, those we define them as those under 35, and the women's vote in California. For all of those groups, and independents now 1 in 5, Latinos about 1 in 5 of voters, youth as we define it about 1 in 4, women the majority of the vote. All of those votes Democratic leaning now in California, which has as well as the Democratic registration altogether. If we look at the leanings of independent voters and those who've been affiliated but not too long with elections, all favoring Democrats in a way that we now really are a deep blue state. So not surprisingly, very significant and large vote for Obama in this election. and a vote to return Senator Feinstein to Washington for another 6 years. Votes which had consequences down the line for the legislative races. Now there are a supermajority of Democrats in the state legislature. In the House races, there were pickups in House races for Democrats in California, and had consequences, I feel, for the outcomes of a number of key propositions, specifically Prop 30 and Prop 32. The one constant through this election cycle which we saw, which I think is important to think about as we go into 2013, is distrust in government, particularly distrust in the state and federal government, and especially low approval ratings for Congress and our state legislature. And I think it's very important to keep in mind as we think through the meaning and consequences of this current election that Californians have been pretty steady over the last few years, and I will expect to see that in our upcoming polls, in terms of how they rate and how they approve of the performance of the legislatures at the federal and state level, and how much trust they have in the actions of government at the state and federal level. So what's next in 2013? Well, we're going to, for the first time in a very long time, experience in California ruled by a legislative supermajority at a time when there remain to be a number of unresolved budget issues. There will be, as we heard from Mac Taylor today, an improving revenue situation, but still some very serious financial issues for California to face, the so-called wall of debt, whatever the consequences of the fiscal cliff or the avoidance of the fiscal cliff in Washington might mean for California. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that California voters showed, even in their varying levels of support, extremely varying levels of support for Prop 38 and Prop 30, that this is not a time in which Californians necessarily feel, that they've changed their opinions about taxes or state government. Our legislative leaders have signaled an interest in tax reform and initiative reform. We're not exactly sure how that will be defined, but that will be very interesting to see how that plays out. For us, looking at the results of our polling and watching this election this year and in recent years, we hope that there is progress made in improving California's democracy in these three areas. First of all, engaging the emerging voters. Rather than feeling satisfied with the outcome of this election, what can we do to improve voter registration and improve voting in elections, particularly non-presidential elections? Because, for instance, our June primary had a very low turnout, which has been the experience of recent June primaries. We'd like to see more work done in bridging the knowledge gap, the amount of information that voters have to make decisions on a host of important public policy issues at the ballot. And third, and not least, is that we'd like to see an increase in the transparency in which the initiatives that appear on the ballot are described, in terms of who's the funding and where is the funding source and who's behind it. And we don't say that necessarily because, as an institute, that's our goal so much as that's what the voters are telling us in the polls. That's one of the things that they find most distressing and disturbing and difficult to sort through on the propositions, is trying to understand who's on the yes and no side. Looking ahead to the 2014 election, a few things that we're interested in following. First of all, what will happen with the June primary turnout in that election, particularly because that's an election in which we will be choosing the top two candidates that will go on to those executive branch, to run in those executive branch positions, from governor to insurance commissioner. as well as the legislative races, and how that plays out will be very, very interesting. Given the trends in GOP registration, which Mark has referred to, and the lack of success that Republicans have had in statewide elections over the course of the last decade, if not longer, it will be very interesting to see whether there is an emergence of people who identify as independents who appear on the ballot and then make it into the top 2 primary, and to see whether or not that becomes a trend in our state. We'll be very interested in seeing whether the Secretary of State is able to initiate the same-day registration, and if so, how that becomes implemented in terms of what that's going to mean for voter turnout in 2014. The goal is to try to implement same-day registration, but I understand that there are some administrative hurdles around that. And then, of course, the big question will be, how do the Democrats handle the supermajority situation over the next couple of years, and what does that mean in terms of maintaining that supermajority, and of course, the big question as to whether Jerry Brown will indeed seek a fourth to be reelected and what will appear to be a 4th term in office. So I leave those questions with you and those thoughts, and appreciate the interest in our work today as well as throughout the election year. Thank you.
You both mentioned how California has become a deep blue state. I find it interesting, however, though, at this last election, when the first time that in American history voters voted to approve gay marriage and voted to approve the legalization of marijuana for recreational use, that those happened in other states other than California. And in fact, over the last 4 years, both of those issues were voted down by California voters. Why is that? Why is this very liberal state voting down those two very key progressive issues?
The gay marriage one, the most recent, to me was a very interesting election, and I honestly believe that Prop 8 could have been defeated, which would have been the gay marriage side, had the campaign been run differently. But campaigns matter, and I believe that the Yes Side campaign on Prop 8 was much more effective, and in the closing week, it's my judgment, if I look at our polls and I look at the exit polls, Catholics swung about 15 points. And they were always, in my mind, because they were so closely divided in the pre-election polls, they were always the swing vote. So religion mattered. And, I think there is a long-term progression toward greater support for both issues in this state. We'll have to see how well the campaigns are run. It's not a slam dunk either way, but I think, just the changing demographics and the support of youth on both of those over time will increase its chances of passage here.
So I think those are two very different issues that you mentioned. I do think that attitudes are changing towards gay marriage not only in California but nationally. As the president said this year, his views evolved on the issue. Anytime another state or another country changes its rules, and things seem to to go on, it gives people, I think, more comfort in making change. The one area which I was most interested that was on our ballot that to me signaled that there is not, maybe deep blue implies candidates and not always issues and causes, was the death penalty. 3 strikes changed, right? The death penalty, it wasn't by a lot, but it lost. And so, again, I really caution us from thinking that, meaning going in the direction of a deep blue state doesn't mean that there might be some, that everything's going to be, that everything's going to tilt towards a liberal point of view.
If I could just follow up on that last point Mark made on the death penalty, because I thought that was the most interesting of the ballot propositions, too. If you look at the vote on Prop 34, according to Coastal California and according to inland California, coastal California being all the counties that touch San Francisco Bay or the Pacific Ocean, it carried by about 3 or 4 points. But it was inland California voting this thing down by 23, 24 points. When you think of California, especially on social issues, it's important to remember we're not just the coast, and that's what the national press kind of makes us out to be. The inland voters oftentimes hold sway, and they certainly did on the death penalty.
Those are good quotes for me, so I'm in good shape now. Thank you. We have a question over here.
Yeah, this is Tim Hurt with the Ventura County Star. Mark DiCamillo, I wanted to follow up on something you said about the under 35 ethnic voters and how you were specifically referencing social issues, presumably abortion and same-sex marriage. I'm wondering, does that apply to other issues as well? I mean, is the under 35 portion of both ethnic and non-Hispanic white voters, are they substantially similar in other ways?
Well, I mean, the thing that's so unique about the social issues and why I pointed it out is you don't see the same generational gap among white non-Hispanics. There is an age difference on lots of issues. Taxation issues are key. Prop 30, younger voters were fundamental to the support and passage of Prop 30. Older voters were against it. I think that holds true within the ethnic voting community as well as within the white community. So again, the reason I emphasize the social issues is because it was something that is not normally there. And I think it relates to generational status and immigration and just becoming a part of the, becoming an American and, this melting pot. But lots of, I can defer to Mark, there's so many issues where differences on generation apply to both ethnic and white voters.
We have a question over here.
Gary Passmore with the Congress of California Seniors, and so you can guess where my question's coming from. I know nationally that President Obama trailed among senior voters by something like 11%. I haven't seen anything about how older voters in California behaved. And then a kind of related question, I'd be interested to know, I saw a lot of commentary post-election from Republicans who said, well, we've got this huge increase in baby boomers coming along, and they're going to be on our side, not on the other team. And I'm wondering if you see that in any of your polling. Do people keep their party identities as they age, or do they shift to prevailing more conservative views with their cohort?
Want to? Go ahead, Mark.
I think that there definitely, and this is what I think the challenge is for the Republican Party now. People develop patterns and then they tend to stick with them. There might be people might get more conservative in their attitudes, but for those who are joining parties, they're joining parties, and then it becomes more difficult to change. The thing about the younger voters now, which creates a little bit more flexibility, is the large numbers of people who are signing up as no party preference. So they have different attitudes about joining a party than other generations had, as well as joining other things. And so that is going now. Right now, their attitudes. Their attitudinal preferences and the values behind those are lining up with the Democrats. One thing that I just wanted to mention, and this is related to the age issue, but has broader consequences. The challenge for the Republicans when we talk about the fact that these key groups are leaning Democrat or heavily registered Democrat right now is that we did some analyses around around issues, and it's as if there's in each case an issue which is a significant roadblock for the Republicans to make inroads. For young voters, same-sex marriage is what is distinguishing young voters in their strong preference from about this issue from others. For Latino voters, it would be immigration, in particular immigration reform. For women, gun control. I mean, you can go down the list in terms of where Republicans have staked out claims on issues and see what the areas of alienation are for those voters who are leaning Democratic today.
We have a question from our President Emeritus.
It's the Ex-President's Club. John Myers from KXTV. This is for Mark Squared, so either one of you take it. But I do want to get back to what both of you said about the view of government, because Mark DiCamillo, you talked about this trend with ethnic voters and how they value government. I think that was the quote you used a moment ago. And yet, Mr. Baldassare, as you pointed out, historically, California voters have a lot of skepticism, unhappiness with government. So can we find a way to meld those two together? I mean, is this a not happy with particular things in government, but more willing to give government room? I mean, and ping it back to try to make those two match.
Well, vis-a-vis this election, government, the biggest initiative that related to government was Prop 30, and there was never a clear outcome for that race, I think, until the last few weeks. And then I think you saw the governor really take hold of the issue. And if you saw, I don't know if everybody saw today's LA Times, but they basically said that there were almost as many voters who said the most important vote they cast on Election Day was actually on Prop 30, as said the presidency. Now that is very unusual. Usually voting for president in a presidential year just is the dominant reason for voting. So clearly in the last fortnight, the governors raised the salience of the issue, and I believe it had a big effect in kind of bringing people to the realization that if this thing doesn't pass, among the ethnic vote especially, government services will be cut and my life will be worse, whether it be my kids, whether it be health care, whether it be whatever the government provides, it's all going to be cut back, the entryway to college. And so by framing it in that way, I think the governor was very effective. We had a question in our final poll that basically asked people about the seriousness they felt of the automatic spending cuts if Prop 30 failed. And if you said you were very concerned about that, and 58% of the voters in our sample said they were, you were very likely to be voting yes on Prop 30. And so I think your view of government at least has to be limited to certain, points in time. And on this particular election, I thought the governor did well to exploit that, and it really played well in the Latino and ethnic voting community.
John, I'm going to try to answer your question this way, and it has to do with some focus groups that we did earlier in the year. I really wanted to hear firsthand from Californians about their views on government. And when you do Democratic voters, they will tell you they don't trust government, and they don't particularly like the way the legislature acts, and they're really worried about special interests and all these things. But when push comes to shove, we need more money, so we'll go along with this. And Republicans will will go in the same direction. We don't like this, we don't like that, and so forth. And we think that there's got to be some way to find the money through cost savings from waste in government, right? And then you have the independents and moderates in California who can be swayed in either direction on this. And in this particular election, because the governor had lined up cuts to schools, which is what people consistently tell us what they least like to happen, and the ability to focus funds into education, new tax revenues into education, what they tell us they most want to happen, and the governor was able to negate negate the no side, if that makes any sense, but he really did, the last couple of weeks. I think, that made the difference, but that being a pretty special circumstance still. So that's how I would look at how people view the role of government and the willingness to tax and comfort with spending differently depending upon their partisanship, except for these people in the middle who can be swayed either way.
And I would just try to separate out in your mind when you're thinking of ethnic voters. Clearly, Latinos are one huge part of that. Asian Americans, however, it's a polyglot of voters, but they are much more in play and much more, according to our polls, as we've been polling them more and more, 45% of Asian American voters are no party preference voters. These are voters that do not have strong ties with either party. They happen to vote very strongly for the Democrat and for Prop 30 on this election. But I wouldn't count on them in every election voting the same way. I think they're entrepreneurial. There are a lot of things that they don't like about government. So, you have to take each election, each issue one at a time, and I agree with Mark. It's not, again, the simplistic notion that California is this, I guess it's coastal California's ethics, mores, and values that is driving the whole state is a misnomer, and the state has this huge interior, which actually, population-wise, is marginally growing bigger and bigger. And they still seem to be more Republican in their registration, and they vote that way. They voted for Romney by 2 points. So, interesting.
We have a question over here.
Hey, it's Ben Adler with Capital Public Radio, and just getting a little bit more into the no-party preference voters that you're talking about. I wonder if we have a better view now of who they are and their positions and how they break down. Are they people who are disaffected with both parties? Are they in the center? Are they people who are accounting for the drop in Republican registration by being Republican-leaning but just don't feel that they have a place in the California Republican Party? Are they conservative fiscally but socially liberal? Any of those true? Other stuff? What can you say?
I would say the first thing that you have to realize about this phenomenon is a growing phenomenon every year, and the reason why it's a growing phenomenon is that it's usually bringing in larger and larger shares of new voters. And so when you think of them demographically, you have to think of them, generally speaking, as younger. I mean, younger in a broad sense, under the age of 45, let's say, would be what my profile would be in my mind. And I clearly do not believe they are disguised Republicans. If you look at them on most issues, they tend to go along with the Democrats. There certainly are exceptions, but that's one of the, if it's the swing voting bloc in this state, I mean, Republicans would have to carry no party preference voters now by 10 or 15 points to outweigh just the Democratic advantage, and you're not seeing that at all. It's not even close. But I do think they are less affiliated and more in play. They don't hold the same ideological, partisan, hard and fast views. And again, there's a fair share of Latinos in there, but I would profile them more, at least within the ethnic community, as the Asian voters. But a large number of even white non-Hispanic younger voters are coming in as no party preference. It's just the extreme partisanship that is taking place not only in Sacramento, and you can see that in the legislature. There's lack of accommodation and compromise, but look at what's going on in Washington. And voters are not that way. They want the Republicans to work with the Democrats to compromise, to come up with legislation that meets both sides at least part of the way. You're not seeing that, and as long as that continues, more and more of the new voters will refuse either of the parties.
I was on a panel once in Washington with one of our polling colleagues, Claudia Dean, who's been at the Pew Research Center and Washington Post and is now at Kaiser Family Foundation, and she said of independent voters, men who won't commit, and there is some truth to that, so that's why I mention it, because independent voters, if you look at our profile and our polls, more likely to be men than women by large numbers, and voters who say when you ask them, have you ever belonged to a party? Would you ever be willing to join a party? Even by larger numbers saying, no way. You know, we don't see ourselves as being members of a party. Most of them describe themselves as middle of the road in their politics. And if I was going to take a step further based on their individual attitudes, it would be liberal on social attitudes. They're younger, too. So liberal on social attitudes, more conservative on fiscal attitudes than Democrats, but less conservative than Republicans. So willing to move on a fiscal issue. So there you have it.
We have a question back here.
Hey, gentlemen. Alan Young, Comstocks Magazine. Now, acknowledging that it is a widely diverse state, does the voting in of a supermajority prescribe any sort of mandate for Democrats? And if it does, what do you think it is, and do you think they'll follow it?
I don't think voters, if it were on the ballot, would choose a two-thirds majority of one party or the other. It just happens that way as they're voting in the districts, and it adds up, and this is what we ended up with. I think if we polled on it, they'd be fearful of that. So I think the Democrats have to be somewhat cautious in the use of their power. And I think, actually, as I was mentioning before I got up here, I think the ultimate break on democratic rule will be the initiative process. That if the Democrats refuse to take on an issue like pension reform, you'll see it at the ballot. And that's actually a good thing, in my judgment, that we have some break on one-party rule. I'm a no-party preference kind of guy.
So I think that there are a number of reasons why we have a supermajority, and we should just be mindful of that. First of all, the fact that President Obama won by, a huge margin in California really helped the Democratic candidates for House and the state legislature. The fact that there was an independent redistricting, and this was the first, the first election with that, what it meant was that the legislature caught up with what the party breakdown was, because the way those districts were built 10 years ago, and I'm amazed that you could build districts that would be so supportive of the incumbents and the party that controlled that districts, but that's what happened. Meant that there were a lot of Republicans who were locked into seats, that when you had more competition, you got something that looked more like, the 30%. Where Republicans are today. How Californians respond to supermajority really depends upon what issues and policy directions we go in. If there's less gridlock, if people feel like that we're making progress on issues that are of importance to them, then I would expect that the legislature's approval rating will slowly but surely improve. And if the economy improves in the budget situation, if people sense that things are moving in a direction which is not the direction that they want to move in, then they're not going to like what they see at all. But this is a really very interesting outcome and the big unknown for next year that we're all wondering about. What is governance going to be like in California with the supermajority?
We have time for a couple more questions. I just wanted to point out how nice the marks look against our new backdrop. Anyways, we have a question right here.
Anything that helps. Thank
Hi,
you.
guys. Micah Weinberg. I run a consultancy called the Healthy Systems Project. I'm now over 35. I'm a small business owner, so there are significant parts of me that actually want to become a Republican, but there's no way whatsoever that I would affiliate with the current California Republican Party. So let's imagine that the leadership of the California Republican Party understands that this needs to be a moment of significant rethinking of their messaging or priorities or what have you, and they bring in the two of you, maybe individually, maybe together, and say, what is it that we should do to return to being a majority party in California? Based on your polling data, what would you recommend to them?
Divide the state in two and govern inland California.
So, despite the fact that a lot of people who aren't registered to vote today don't seem like they would be particularly likely to register as Republican, if you're in the Republican leadership in California today, You have to look at those 5.5 million people who aren't registered to vote and try to figure out how to get some of those newly registered people to register as Republicans. I mean, because if there's a party that needs new voters, it's the Republican Party today, because they're so far, behind in terms of registration now. And as I mentioned earlier, for each one of those groups that has been now leaning Democratic pretty consistently over the last few elections, there are issues. There are issues that are significant roadblocks. And I think you have to figure out how important those issues, do those issues represent values, or are there other values that are more important to the party? So that's what I would say. Look at those issues and how important it is to maintain, your reputation around those issues. But you need new voters. Desperately need new voters.
We have a question over here.
Bob Fairbanks, Capital Morning Report. Do you correlate with your polls and information campaign spending? Do you see any sign that amounts of money spent affect people who might go, an ethnic group that might go one way but is influenced by an amount of money, or anybody that is influenced by, or how do you see the influence of campaign spending affecting the election results?
I think money spent in campaigns, especially on high-profile, what we cover are statewide elections. Obviously, lots are going on at the local level and congressional level, but at the statewide level, I think money is best spent if you want to defeat an initiative. I think money has a power to defeat most initiatives. I was actually very surprised in this election cycle at the absence of no-side campaigning on the Stayer initiative, Prop 39. I think that could have been vulnerable. 3 strikes, we saw that about 5 years ago when the governor and Mayor Feinstein, or Senator Feinstein got up in an ad and literally changed public opinion on the reform of 3 strikes almost overnight through just a week's worth of advertising. I think money has a powerful effect if you just want to raise people's doubts, and you can get them mostly to vote no on an initiative. If I were to go into campaign consulting, I'd only do no-side campaigns that were well-funded.
Yeah. So, I agree that money on the no side for initiatives is hugely important, which was why it was so interesting the way our governor handled the money on the no side for Prop 30 and on the yes side for Prop 32, because one of the things that happens to voters is that initiatives are very complicated. So in terms of looking for a shorthand of how you understand where you're going to line up on an initiative, I mean, you probably do it too. You look through the voter pamphlet and you try to get any kind of information. You don't see it there, so you go to the internet. Who's supporting the yes side and who's supporting the no side? And do they represent the kind of values that we do? And so where do I stand on that initiative? That's why I think that's why I think the voters place such great importance on transparency now around wanting to have information. So it's not just about how much money it is, but it's about where the money is coming from. Is it coming from out of state? Is it coming from in state? Is it business? Is it labor? Is it both? And so that's something which I think needs to be fixed about our initiative process.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Yes, do you gentlemen truly believe that the new Citizen Reapportionment Commission was not in favor of Democrats? Because when they rejected the fellow from the Rose Institute, who was a genuine expert, he was summarily rejected. But do you really feel that it was a balanced commission?
I'm only as good as my polls. Voters on the commission really were not up to speed in terms of following it. They were, it's just one of those inside baseball things that does not attract their attention. And for that reason, I have no opinion, because the voters pretty much have no opinion on those kind of things.
I don't have any opinions from my polls, but I know the folks at the Rose Institute, and they've been good colleagues. I have a lot of respect for the work they do. I know the people who were chosen to do the work. I have a lot of respect for what they do as well. I know some of the people who were on the commissions and have heard their reports about how they went about doing their work and what citizen input looked like during the process. And I think the outcome, if you look at the outcome, there's more competition. There are districts that geographically and politically make more sense. It's hard to take all of the politics out of redistricting, but a lot of things I thought got accomplished in the redistricting. Now, the ultimate outcome meant that there are more Democrats, but I think that really reflects the change that occurred in the last 10 years in terms of party registration.
That was a rather quick answer, so I guess we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I wanted to ask specifically about the youth vote. There was so much talk about the youth carrying this election, and I heard exit polls showing that up to 28% and that kind of thing. To what extent did youth impact the outcome of this election?
I never use exit polls to really judge the specific size of a group of voters, whether it's Latinos or youth or specific size, because an exit poll, is a survey that the data has been weighted in some way and so forth, but it's not an overall assessment of the entire electorate. I would say in the last few elections, not just 2012, but if I look back to 2008 and 2004, the youth vote has been sizable and significant for the Democrats in California, and was very important for the support that Prop 30 received. But whether this youth vote was larger than others, I don't use exit polls for that purpose. I look at really how that group responded to something on the ballot, and they responded positively to some of the things that ended up winning, and certainly were significant for that reason, because older voters, tipped in a different direction.
I do want to first agree with Mark that exit polls should not be taken at face value in all their respects. They are valuable because they're being done on Election Day. My God, I would love to do a poll on Election Day. However, the problem with the exit poll, really, it's becoming more complicated to do an exit poll. So I have sympathy for my colleagues who try to do them. What's really complicating their lives is almost analogous to what's going on in the pre-election polling world, where we have cell phone people over here and landline people over here. Now we got to do 2 samples. Well, the exit polls have precinct voters over here and mail ballot voters over here, and they got to not only measure them both properly, they have to combine them, and they have no idea what the relative sizes are before the election or on Election Day. They have no idea. So when I look at the exit poll in California, it looks to me like they had a little problem in the mix of the mail ballot voters with the precinct voters, because the numbers that are coming out among young voters is just so high, I find it hard to believe. And actually, it was interested, the LA Times is out today with a new poll, and they had a column in their poll report on voters, people who said they voted in this week's election. So I naturally migrated to the age demographic, and it was 20%. And I'm going, oh, this is the 18 to 29-year-old segment, which the exit poll says was 28%. So I just think they have a high side estimate and leave it at that. The rest of the poll is fine. I mean, you know, I have quibbles here and there with this group and that. I'm a perfectionist down to the last digit. But, you know, the bottom line, the exit polls were good, but they have a high side estimate of the youth vote in this state. It's no way we could have been at that level. And it might have even been in their national polls. Just as an aside, I looked at the Pew likely voter turnout. Pew does such wonderful work nationally. Right before the election on Monday, they came out with a poll of 3,500 adults in which they had 4 columns in their report saying, here's the demographics of all the adults, here's the demographics of the registered voters, and here's the demographics of the over 2,500 likely voters. Well, I looked at their estimates of the age of the national voting electorate, and they were spot on, 3 points for Obama. So, I mean, Pew does an excellent job for pre-election surveys. They had 8-point lower estimate of the under, I think, 40 or 45 segment than the exit poll had nationally. So I don't think it was just limited to California. They had a high side estimate in the youth vote, it seemed to me, across the board. But again, I'm relying on Pew nationally, and I'm just relying on my instincts of California here on their exit poll.
Speaking of high side estimates, I've kept you all here 15 minutes longer. I apologize. Please give another thank you to the Mark and Mark Show.